Oops. Okay, so today we are going to embark on the last historical book in the Old Testament, Nehemiah. And when we have finished Nehemiah, we will have finished our survey of the Old Testament. I also need to read the book of Psalms, which I'll get around to before I can say I've completely finished off the Old Testament. But once I get done Nehemiah, I'll have done everything but Psalms. And I'm looking forward to that. Nehemiah is 13 or 14 chapters long. I do not expect to be able to get through it all today, but we will give it a try. We will get at least part of it done, and if I don't get it done today, I'll finish off the rest of it, hopefully tomorrow. Nehemiah was a contemporary of Ezra, likely also a contemporary of Malachi. Ezra, in fact, does appear a couple times here in the book of Nehemiah. Their ministries overlapped. Ezra was a priest and a Torah teacher, a scribe, teacher of the law, and a temple reformer. He was a religious authority. He was not the high priest. He was from the family line of the high priest, but he was not a high priest. But he was a religious authority. In some ways, he may have actually had more authority than the high priest, because he was commissioned by the King Artaxerxes to go teach go to the temple of God in Jerusalem and teach the Jews there about the Torah. And in some ways, he may have actually had more authority than the acting high priest at the time. Nehemiah is going to come as a governor. He will be a civic authority. He will be a civil leader. He is not a priest. He is not, as far as I can tell, he's not even from the royal line of David. But he is an appointed governor, appointed by the king of Persia, Artaxerxes. And he will be arriving in Jerusalem sometime after Ezra has already been there. We read about Ezra from Ezra chapters 7 through 10. And that was in the king's 7th year. This is now down the king's 20th year. So about 13 years later, after Ezra gets to Jerusalem, Nehemiah is going to go there. So sometime during that time frame, Ezra is there, and we'll see him later in the book of Nehemiah. So Ezra has been there during this time. Malachi the prophet probably has been too. It's really hard to identify exactly how Malachi fits into the time frame, but it seems like that he would fit in somewhere in here too. So you have a priest, a prophet, and a judge. So basically priest, prophet, and king. You have Ezra the priest and scribe, Malachi the prophet, Nehemiah the governor / the judge or the king, the civic authority, who are all going to be ministering at around the same time here in the 440s BC. This actually starts in the year 444 BC. Artaxerxes had a long reign, and this is only halfway through his reign. Nehemiah. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, this is December. He is counting his years based on the Babylonian calendar, which starts in September, our time. Now, the Jewish calendar originally was supposed to start in the spring with Passover. When we read the law back in the day, 2 years ago now practically, Nisan, the month that would eventually be called Nisan, which equates to our March or so, was their first month of the year, and that's when the Passover was. Because essentially, it marked the beginning of their nation. The Passover itself marked the beginning of the Hebrew people as a nation, and not just an extended group of people from a family. So everything they did was kind of oriented around marking, like that's why their days began at sunset, because they left Egypt in sunset. They were told to eat with their cloaks ready and their walking staffs handy, because at any time the order may be sent to go out. So that's why their days began at night. That's why their their year began in March, or our March, Passover, because that essentially marked the beginning of their nation. However, at this point in time, they are living under Persian occupation. The Persians adopted the Babylonian calendar system, where the year began in the fall with the month of Tishri, which equates to our September. So this is December, our December. in the 20th year. So the 20th year would have begun a couple months earlier in our September, about 2 months before this. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, this would be the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, while I was in the citadel of Susa, this is one of the capital cities of the Persians. They had a couple. The Persian kings would rotate between Susa and Babylon and Ecbatana and Persepolis as their capitals. So this is and we read about this. Esther took place in the citadel of Susa. This was not their only capital, but this was one of the Persian capitals. And the kings would move around depending on the time of the year and the circumstances. And right now they're in the capital of Susa, or Nehemiah is at least. While I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, this is probably one of his actual blood brothers, one of his members of his immediate family, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. Now, Nehemiah apparently had never been to Jerusalem before. He is one of those Jews who grew up outside of Jerusalem during the exile in Persia. I don't know how old he is here. Nehemiah's age is never given to us. He lives a long time after this, so he probably isn't too old at this point, though I don't really know. But at any rate, however old he would have been, this is 444 BC. The exile ended in 538 BC when they were given the permission to go back. So he would have been born outside the land, but not in exile, in the sense that there's nothing stopping him from voluntarily going back at any time. It doesn't appear as though he had done that. His brother is apparently dead, at least to perform some sort of reconnaissance mission. I don't know if Hanani went there to stay, or maybe he went there to go check the place out and come back with a report. I'm not sure. Those details simply are not given. At any rate, Hanani is coming to Susa with some information about Jerusalem for Nehemiah, or at the very least Nehemiah is asking him about that. And here's what they say. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace." So they just can't be at peace, can they be? "The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. Remember, public mourning was acceptable. It's like when you were upset, when you were distressed about something, with an exception, as we'll read about here in chapter 2. But when you were upset or distressed about something, you were expected to make that publicly known. They did not believe in the sort of stoic suffering that we believe in today, where you don't exhibit signs of emotional distress in public. Like that was not how they conducted themselves back then, even the men. Okay? So when you hear upsetting news and you get upset, you act that out, you perform. It's a sort of performative mourning where you display your emotions quite literally on your sleeves so people know that you are in distress. Now, he's not supposed to do this in the presence of the king, as we'll read about in chapter 2. But he's not in the presence of the king here. He's on his own. "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house." So there's yet another example of a righteous man praying on behalf of his people and including himself in their sin. We saw Daniel do this 80 years ago when he was praying for the restoration of the city for God's name's sake. We saw Ezra do this in the previous chapters. Nehemiah does this. They're not saying it's their fault. I'm doing the right thing, but they're not, so forgive them and bless them. They're completely including themselves in the nation's sin. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. That's at the end of Leviticus and the end of Deuteronomy. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I'll gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Read about that at the end of Deuteronomy 28, 29, and 30. That's what he's referring to here. They are your servants and your people, so here's Nehemiah speaking again, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. That's all the faithful people. It could be referring to Hanani, Nehemiah's brother, and the men who came back with him. I'm sure they're included in that category, but it's really just anyone who's faithful. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. And I was cupbearer to the king. The man refers to the king. He is going to ask this man, the king, for permission to go back to Jerusalem and do something about this sad state of affairs. I do not know exactly what all is going on here. There are some details I think we may be missing. The wall has generally been in disrepair since Nehemiah's army destroyed it way back in 586 BC. That would have been over 140 years earlier at this point. And the wall would not have been rebuilt since then. However, it is possible that there have been attempts to rebuild the wall. They had rebuilt the temple, after all. And we know from Haggai they were rebuilding their own houses too, presumably in Jerusalem, although we don't know that for certain. So there have been some attempts to rebuild. And like I said, they have rebuilt the temple by this point. But there's also been opposition to their rebuilding. We read about that back in Ezra. Remember how we read in Ezra when they got back the land, they laid the foundation for the temple, and they built the altar, and they were going to get started. Some of them were discouraged by the size of the foundation as compared to the previous one that they remembered. Some of the older men who were still alive that remembered the temple that had been destroyed 50 years earlier saw the foundations for this new one and were distressed at how much less impressive this new one was going to be. And then after that, some people from around the area, people who are already living there, the Samaritans, people who had been in the land from before, people who had come back from Samaria, who had been descendants of the mixed marriages implemented by the Assyrians when they conquered the northern kingdom or thereabouts, or even people who had stayed in the land after Nebuchadnezzar conquered it, or maybe Edomites who had been moving into the land from their territory, which we read about. Also, the Edomites kind of getting moved out of their traditional territory and kind of getting forward. There's a lot of these different people groups that were already there and were not happy about the idea of the Jews coming back and reclaiming this territory. And we read about that in Ezra 4 and how they tried to oppose the building of the temple and any other building being done in Jerusalem. And we read this weird letter they sent. Now, this is out of order when we read through Ezra from beginning to end. This series, this context, this set of letters that are written here are out of order in terms of the context of what's going on at the time. Because this is about the building of the temple, which happened in the reign of Darius, and that's 60 or so years ago by this point. But we have a weird little flash forward to the reign of Artaxerxes, where they send a letter to Artaxerxes about the trouble these Jews are causing. Now, this would have been after the temple was built. Okay, the temple was built in the reign of Darius the first. This is Artaxerxes. This is 60 or 70 years later. This is the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So this is probably before Nehemiah 1. Okay, Nehemiah has this vision, or has this report given to him by his brother who had gone to Jerusalem and come back. And Nehemiah has it on his heart to go to Jerusalem to fix this problem. But he's got a problem because the king himself had ordered construction on Jerusalem to stop. So I'm going to go back to Ezra 4, which itself is a flash forward to later. It's out of order chronologically with this part of the text. But this has probably already happened by the time Nehemiah 1 takes place. So that Nehemiah would have this in mind as he's making plans to go to the king to ask for permission to rebuild Jerusalem. So Ezra 4, starting in verse 8, Rehum the commanding officer and Shimshai the secretary wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes the king as follows. Rehum the commanding officer and Shimshai the secretary, together with the rest of their associates, the judges and officials over the men from Tripolis, Persia, Erech, and Babylon, the Elamites of Susa, and the other people whom the great and honorable Ashurbanipal, that was an Assyrian king from the 600s BC, deported and settled in the city of Samaria and elsewhere in the region beyond the river. That'd be the river Euphrates, west of Euphrates River. This is the copy of the letter they sent him to King Artaxerxes. From your servants, the men of Trans-Euphrates, or even beyond the region beyond the river. The king should know that the Jews who have come up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid, and the royal revenues will suffer. Now, since we are under obligation to the palace, and it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we are sending this message to inform the king, so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records you will find that this city is a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place of rebellion from ancient times. We inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in the region beyond the river. The king sent this reply to Rehum the commanding officer, Shimshai the secretary, and the rest of their associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. Greetings. The letter you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Now remember, I don't know exactly what he's referring to here because we don't get a specific example, but remember, back when Nebuchadnezzar came upon this city and destroyed it, it was because Zedekiah rebelled against him. Jehoiakim had rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. That provoked Nebuchadnezzar to keep coming back against Jerusalem. He ended up coming to it 3 times and besieging it 3 separate times before finally destroying it. That could be what they're referring to. I'm assuming it probably is. It was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of the region beyond the river, and taxes, tribute, and duty are paid them. That could be a reference to David and Solomon. I don't know exactly. Now, issue an order to these men to stop work, that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests? As soon as a copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary, and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. That probably has already happened by the time Nehemiah 1 takes place. In fact, that might even be why Nehemiah's brother goes to Jerusalem to find out what's going on. Maybe. It appears as though the wall itself has been in ruins since Nebuchadnezzar knocked it down. It appears as though there was an attempt to rebuild it at some point before Nehemiah 1, and that got stopped by the men around Jerusalem, the men of the tribes and leaders and nations around there, by appealing to King Artaxerxes to not let it happen, and he agreed. He stopped that project, and it would have stayed still for some time. Don't know how long. This is the 20th year of Artaxerxes. Ezra went to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. So probably sometime in those 13 years in between, there was an effort to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and that got stopped. It might even have been burned. The whole thing about it being burned with fire that we mentioned here in Nehemiah 1 may have been because the people were being forced to stop, and so whatever progress they had made with the gates was burned at the time. That's my thinking. We don't know this for sure. It seems weird that Nehemiah would have this kind of reaction if the destruction that he's referring to, that is the news of this destruction that his brother is bringing to him, causes him such emotional distress. It would seem weird if that's referring only to the destruction Nebuchadnezzar wrought 140 years ago. That just seems weird to me. Because Nebuchadnezzar would have lived his whole life knowing that had happened. That was 140 years ago. it sounds like he's getting news that he was not expecting to get, or bad news that he was not prepared for, which indicates to me that there has been trouble more recently than Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the city, which happened 140 years earlier. So my guess in that, with the letter I just read, which is actually included in Ezra 4, my guess is that at some point after Ezra got there, which Ezra has been there for 13 years now, because Ezra went there in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, and this is the 20th year of Artaxerxes. At some point during that time, there was an attempt to rebuild the walls and reestablish the city governmentally and not just religiously. The temple's already been up for like 60 years at this point. The temple was finished and dedicated in 515 BC. So that was 60 plus years ago. So, but the walls have not been rebuilt, and there have been some houses, like we read in Haggai, that they were building their own houses, which I presume were in Jerusalem. So there's been some rebuilding going on, but they're not going to have a fully rebuilt city until the walls are built, because most people are not going to want to live in a city without walls. And so it seems like there was an effort to do so in between Ezra's arrival and Nehemiah's arrival, and that was forcibly stopped and may have even been burned afterwards, and that is what is setting Nehemiah off here. That's what it seems like to me. I don't know this for certain. There is information that I think we're not being given. But that's the only way that I can really understand Nehemiah's response here, because he would have known all his life the city walls were in disrepair from Nebuchadnezzar's invasion, because that would have happened 100 years plus before he was born. So simply hearing about that, I don't think would have sent him into this emotional tailspin. That seems weird to me.